The Great Pyramid is part of an attempt to create a three-dimensional model of the afterlife realm. Not only does the Great Pyramid give us the dimensions of the Earth, but it does so on a scale defined by the Earth itself.
The weathering and erosion that I saw on the Sphinx was not compatible with Sahara Desert hyper-arid conditions. They said this was absolutely impossible because there's no civilization when you go back to 5,000 to 7,000 BC that could construct the Sphinx.
Who built these things? They were built by the crocodile kings. Now that might be a perfect definition of what the Anunnaki were, because we do see a lot of depictions of them with reptilian features.
The reason we're here, according to many ancient wisdom traditions, is to restore consciousness to its original pure state. There are higher beings in this universe who are trying to help us do that by providing places on Earth to engage in the processes that help restore consciousness.
The Nazca lines are still being revealed. Only recently, Japanese scientists discovered another 70 images in the Nazca Desert by using drone technology. It is very possible that the knowledge of our relationship to the stars existed much earlier and was transmitted to the people of Nazca.
In 2014, Dr. Neil Ross and a team of scientists from the University of Bristol's Glaciology Center published their discovery of a valley the size of the Grand Canyon in West Antarctica. Despite being covered beneath several kilometers of ice, the depression was so vast that it could be seen from space. Some theorists were quick to conclude that before the Great Ice Age, Antarctica, like the 6 other continents, was likely to have been home to ancient civilizations. Dr. Ross eloquently summarized that the implications of his research served merely to demonstrate how much we still have to discover about our planet. But could it be possible that there are ruins, perhaps ruins even older than Göbekli Tepe, to be discovered deep beneath the glaciers?
One of the consequences of global warming is that the ice on the poles has receded tremendously, including Antarctica. And the thickness of the ice, as it is reduced, allows greater visibility from Earth-penetrating radar, so we can see what's underneath the ice. One of the surprises is that the satellite images are sending back now what appear to be large-scale, complex archaeological sites. So they're not small hunting villages and pit houses. These look like advanced technological civilizations that we're seeing underneath the ice. One of the reasons this is a problem for historians is because the ice sheet in Antarctica originated most recently. We've had multiple ice sheets, the most recent about 20,000 years ago. And that opens the door to the question, who was here 20,000 years ago to build complex archaeological structures on the continent of Antarctica? And what role does that play in the history and the mythology that's almost universal of ancient civilizations? It may be what we now see is the 6 cradles of civilization very soon will expand to at least 7 and possibly more.
You get reports occasionally of structures being found emerging out of the ice at Antarctica. Just recently there was one which took my attention to do with what was described as almost like an embanked area, like a hill fault that was found. And that struck my attention as being different to all the other stories. And this raises my hopes that these settlements did actually exist. I think this matter should be looked into more. The only problem is, can we interest archaeologists to spend good money to go to Antarctica to investigate these sites. I think it's possible that as the ice starts to melt in Antarctica, which it is doing more and more, that it will reveal structures. And if this is the case, those structures have probably been buried in the ice for tens of thousands of years. So these are going to be very, very ancient indeed. And they could easily be the product of hybrid descendants.
But who could these descendants be? Researchers like Billy Carson lead us to some new theories on Antarctica and its current location.
Antarctica had once been a tropical island, and that was the center of the so-called pre-Adamite civilization. And it got moved to what's now the South Pole. There might have been some kind of nuclear war that took place on Earth. That's entirely possible. Or there could have been some energetic release from the sun. The resulting effect appears to be that the Atlantean flood becomes the Atlantean glacier, and because it's now in a new position where the water freezes, it turns into Antarctica.
If structures from a pre-Adamite culture might exist below the ice, who are these beings that did not survive a cataclysm? Or did they?
We don't remember where we came from. We don't remember that we were essentially a seeded, genetically created race to be able to inherit the Earth. And what's interesting is the descendants of the Pre-Adamites, the people who were here before the flood, the people who actually messed up, and apparently the Elohim voluntarily let this flood happen to largely wipe out the Pre-Adamites on Earth. So these Pre-Adamites, some of them, apparently still exist. They still have elongated skulls, and they still believe that they are the gods and that we are essentially an invading civilization. And then this new group gets sent in, the Adam, or the modern human form that we all are, with new DNA, genetically modified, tinkered, and sent down here, intended for the spiritual expression of humans to come out. And these pre-Adamite beings became very upset about this. After a great cataclysm that occurred about 12,800 years ago, the survivors of this pre-Adamite group were spread out all across the earth, and they had no way to communicate with each other. So the survivors of this group, which were not pre-Adamite bloodlines, they have been mixed and spliced with local humans, and they became a totally different species.
Could it really be true that there was once an unknown civilization of ancient beings in Antarctica? In 1929, a map was discovered inside Istanbul's Topkapi Palace depicting Antarctica before it was covered with ice. Archaeologists have been able to carbon date the map's creation back to a Turkish admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis, who plotted it in 1513. This age was hundreds of years before the continent was discovered by modern man. Reis's map has both conventional and alternative scholars flummoxed. Where did he gather his knowledge? If the landmass depicted is indeed Antarctica, is it possible that our true origins date back to a prehistoric seafaring civilization? While mainstream scientists are resistant to get behind these findings, no other explanation for the mysteries this map presents have been offered. But with global warming exposing new topography under the glaciers, harder evidence may be just around the corner.
We are about to hear from official sources that architecture has been located in Antarctica that will confirm there was in fact intelligently built ruins down there, and that would be a world-changing thing of significance. This Atlantean legend has an incredible amount of provable data behind it, and if we do get the disclosure that we're being promised, this is going to become an open, public, acknowledged thing that there are in fact stone monuments under the ice in Antarctica that are very ancient. If that happens, everything that we thought we knew about human history has to be rewritten. And we are now dealing with an ancient civilization far predating those which we now acknowledge to be true.
Most academics believe that all Native American people, no matter where you find them, that all of their ancestors came across the Bering Land Bridge, and that they all only had 4 genotypes, A, B, C, and D. Anybody who's a pure-blooded Indian or Native person in the Americas, their whole haplogroup or genetics are A, B, C, or D. But we've tested 3 of these so far, and they are not A, B, C, or D. They show ancestry either from Europe, or the Middle East, or the Middle East people who moved to Europe. So that completely blows the theory that there was only one way to get to the Americas in pre-Columbian times. It means that people were sailing the oceans thousands of years ago, and they knew where they were going, and they had the capability of navigation to be able to circumnavigate the planet. Long before the Vikings, we've been taught so little in school about the history of humanity, and academics have a tendency to not talk to indigenous people about their own history. They think they made their stories up about where their ancestors came from.
These beings are not of a human or a Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon DNA at all. That's actually an entirely different being. And so I think the jury's still out as far as when exactly these beings came, what exactly they are, if they did evolve on Earth and were some sort of lost tribe of the human species, or if they really are indication of the Anunnaki gods, the ones who came from the sky to Earth. And again, it plays into this overall mythology of the fall to Mount Hermon of the 300 Watchers, whether that's in the Bible or the Anunnaki tradition of Enki and Enlil and their families coming and creating humans by mixing their DNA with ours. Perhaps these elongated skulls are evidence of those gods of the ancient world who lived for apparently thousands of years.
As glaciers crack with alarming regularity, Antarctica continues to make headlines. Billy Carson exposes why politicians and astronauts like Buzz Aldrin have been visiting recently. According to his sources, the global cover-up on what is emerging under the ice has reached a critical stage.
You have to understand that there is a very significant difference between how the scholarship on ancient civilizations is seen in the open, unclassified world as opposed to how it's being seen within the secret government and the military-industrial complex. They are going back and they are looking at every single mythology they can find, and they are asking questions which need to have scientific answers. They have started to learn that no matter what the ancient mythology is, if you dig deep enough, and you're going to find out, wait a minute, there's something here that suggests this is not a myth. This is a story about beings that at one time were contacting people on Earth on a widespread basis. They are very aware that extraterrestrial civilizations have been visiting Earth since primordial antiquity. Very quickly, we're going to be dealing with the idea that extraterrestrials were immigrating here. And thus, the reason why we're not finding the trail of pottery shards and all the things that archaeologists want to see that build up into a technological civilization, the reason is because they didn't become technological on Earth. They were already technological when they got here. And they were simply doing what they already knew, which is being able to levitate massive blocks of stone and put them together like Tinker Toys and build these gorgeous pyramids all over the planet.
If this is true, how far did this civilization spread through the world? Billy Carson has an interesting theory about that.
Atlantis was a civilization that covered the entire planet. The main city was in Antarctica and is now under miles of ice. All of their embassies, if you want to call them that, were spread out across the entire Earth and were also destroyed. And some of them are remnants of what we're now finding on the bottom of the ocean.
In 2011, geochemist Stacy Lowry found evidence that America and Antarctica were once joined before 1 billion years of continental drift sent them in different directions. Since then, more geologists have come forward with tests showing that the composition of magnetic isotopes in rocks taken from Antarctica's coastland were indistinguishable from samples of rocks in a rift that runs through the Great Lakes of Michigan. The two rock samples are reportedly the exact same age and have identical chemical properties. If Antarctica was once connected to the Americas, then is it also possible that the same pre-Adamite species once populated both more than 55,000 years ago? Brian Forrester brings us back to the DNA of ancient humans and what it might reveal.
The ancestry of these people could be incredibly complicated. Initial DNA results indicated that at least part of their bloodline is not Native American whatsoever. So we're looking at the possibility that part of their ancestry is from the Middle East, which means they did not cross the Bering Land Bridge like all other Native Americans' ancestors supposedly did. And that would be a major historical discovery. I've been studying these people for about 8 to 10 years. It seems that only the nobility of the Paracas culture of the coast of Peru had elongated skulls. And the preservation in that area is almost perfect. So we do have examples of the skulls with hair. And the hair is always red, and it's genetic red. It's not the result of bleaching or the sun or something like that. And so red hair originates in the Middle East, in Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. So if they had red hair, they likely had light-colored skin, as well possibly as green or blue eyes. All three of those characteristics are not typical of Native American people. So that could very well indicate that those ancestors sailed from the Middle East to the coast of Peru.
In 1928, in a desert on the Paracas Peninsula on the south coast of Peru, archaeologist Julio Tello unearthed a graveyard filled with the remains of corpses with the largest elongated skulls found anywhere in the world. Some were dated back as far as 3,000 years. This discovery shocked scientific communities because it challenged what had been recorded in Peruvian and human history. Tello's discovery has since become known as the Paracas skulls. And even more astoundingly, since 1928, other elongated skulls have been found.
The oldest elongated skulls in the world have been discovered in Iraq, in one specific cave. And the initial DNA testing that we've been able to do indicates that these people had haplogroups which are either from Northern Europe or from the Middle East. What exactly they are will require rigorous scientific examination. We were able to do DNA testing of a baby that died at 18 months and had strawberry blonde hair, which is not Native American. And the analysis that was done indicated that it had segments of DNA that do not match anything known to be human. And we also know that all ancestors of Native Americans, all of their ancestors are believed to have crossed the Bering Land Bridge from South or from Eastern Asia. So nobody from the Middle East or from Europe would walk across all of Asia in order to cross into North America. These ancient people had seafaring skills. They knew how to build boats, and they knew how to sail thousands of years before the Vikings or Columbus or anyone like that. So it's quite likely that they migrated by sea through the Indian Ocean and then across the Pacific.
Skeptics have long dismissed the validity of the remains found with elongated skulls as being scientific proof of pre-Adamites. They claim that these skulls are artificial, an objection made even more complicated by the fact that there have been tribes who practiced cranial deformation on infants.
When it comes to the discovery of elongated heads, a lot of the mainstream scientists might shrug it off and say, well, this is an indication of binding. They believe that humans bound their skulls to make themselves look like they had these massive heads, which doesn't quite make sense unless you actually did have some kind of gods who had those heads and you were trying to imitate those heads.
A cranial deformation is where a newborn child's head is bound, usually with something like leather or possibly wood on the front and back, wrapped with some kind of textile. So by 3 years old, the child's skull is completely bone, and then therefore throughout their life they maintain that design. It was done in order to differentiate physically the nobility from the common class. But you can distinguish between cranial deformation and what I'm talking about. You see the obvious flattening of the front and back of the skull with cranial deformation. I've studied this subject about elongated skulls for about 8 years. And as I said, they did exist on all 6 inhabited continents, but almost all of them are the example of cranial deformation, which is changing the shape of the skull. However, in the case of the Paracas, we have the largest elongated skulls ever found on the planet, and that makes the Paracas culture very specifically interesting. We've even found baby skeletons where the skull is elongated. There was one recently I saw of a probably 3-month-old, and its head was twice the size of normal. So it's not just that the shape is different, the volume is different. And many medical experts have looked at these, and they've said you can change the shape of a baby's head because it's very soft to begin with, but you can't increase the volume. So that by itself is telling us we're looking at a genetic variation.
Billy Carson explores who these royal families were and where they're from.
When we look at these pre-Adamite records of what these ancient texts are telling us, it maps together very nicely with the actual archaeological ruins that we find around the world. What gets even more interesting is when we get into the idea of the post-Atlantean catastrophe world, meaning post-12,500 years ago, 2 pre-Adamite groups survived, one group in Europe and one in Asia, which becomes the Egyptian pharaonic line, and the other group in Mesoamerica, which becomes the Mesoamerican priesthood. They apparently did not have any contact with each other until the time of the conquistadors, roughly about the 1500s or 1600s. According to what we see in these ancient texts, these 2 groups represent what people are calling the Illuminati, what people are calling the New World Order, and the basis for the whole system of the divine right of kings and royal blood. It appears that these elongated skull beings are drawn to places of power where they can assert their control. After the time of Columbus, this group finally was able to communicate with each other again. They wanted to control religion, they wanted to control finances. Some of the information I came across was that these people are still alive today, and that they have elongated skulls and will hide them in public with either wraps or mitre hats, like you see in the Vatican. There are royal burials that have been found from more recent times in France and openly acknowledged where the royalty with their jewels and riches were buried that way, and they had elongated skulls. We furthermore have a very interesting story, which is that one of the royal bloodlines in Italy, where the Vatican and the Roman Empire are located, that one of the royal bloodlines was called the d'Este family. And you have Prince Leonello d'Este and his princess. They both have ridiculously elongated skulls in every illustration. And this is as recent as the 14th century in Italy. The actual bloodline of the d'Este family matriculates into almost the entire European royalty. It goes all over the place: Germany, France, Belgium, Britain. It is unknown how many of these people are still alive on Earth that have the elongated skulls. I've heard a number about 15,000 thrown around. There are those that have suggested there might be more than that, but we don't really know. According to recent eyewitnesses, they have seen people with elongated skulls in places like London, in the financial district, in New York, and in the Vatican.
Is it possible that these ancient elites with elongated skulls are controlling our political and religious organizations? And if so, could this be a way of safeguarding some great secret? Perhaps something of unimaginable value hidden under the ice in Antarctica?
Tom DeLong and a group of military people, including the head of Skunk Works, Lockheed Skunk Works, and they were going to come into this from the ancient past, that the Anunnaki and the Greeks were extraterrestrials. There was another group working allegedly with some of the astronauts who were saying that they've encountered UFOs and they were going to come into an announcement. I was told that the Vatican in Rome, Pope Francis, has been standing, waiting to collaborate with whichever of these groups would be the ones that would tell the truth. We're not alone in the universe. The Vatican is ready to stand up with whoever in the United States makes that announcement. Behind the scenes, there was a Signor Balducci who said that the Vatican had information about extraterrestrials and that there was a decision made in the beginning of the 90s that the Vatican would support announcements of the existence of other life in the universe and say, this reinforces the size and the strength of God.
What kind of information about ancient races on this planet and their connection to Antarctica might be the next reveal? Billy Carson describes Antarctica as a crash site from a nearby planet.
About 55,000 to 60,000 years ago, a group of beings that originated on Mars may have crash landed in Antarctica. This group happened to have very elongated skulls. Not only did they have elongated skulls, but they were about 14 feet tall and had very strange physiology. Researchers have stated that it is obvious that these beings did not develop on Earth, that they had developed in a different area where the barometric pressure was different, the gravitational fields were different, and it explains the differences in their physiology. Could an ET group have understood all of the science and built all of these pyramids right there on the island because they needed to tap into an energy source? So the pyramid is harnessing incredible energy. We see pyramids in Africa, and there's pyramids in Sudan, and all over the world. There are actually forgotten pyramids in Indonesia. So the pyramid is truly a worldwide phenomenon that completely defies anything that makes sense, unless you are well read in Russian science torsion fields, the science of biology and active energy that will in fact feed life and make life healthier and more vibrant. Because that's exactly what happened in the pyramids. Let's say that you inject a white laboratory mouse with a virus or toxin that would normally cause a disease condition to develop in approximately 30% of the specimens. If you give them pyramid energy, instead of 30% mortality, you only get about 3% mortality. And even in cases where the white mice were given doses of toxins so high that 60% of them would die very quickly, only 6% of the mice died in the presence of the pyramid energy fields. There were experiments done with granite slabs that were stored in the pyramids and then positioned into prisons. And all the prisoners who had the granite in their cells suddenly had massive improvements in their behavior. They became friendlier, they became happier. The violence was significantly decreased and nothing else was done. It was really incredible.
Are there scientific principles and mathematical codes intrinsic to the nature of the pyramid shape that this ancient race might have understood?
The pyramid is a really interesting symbol, and I believe it comes from the divine mind itself, because the top point of the pyramid represents the unity, or the center, the central axis of the divine monad, whereas the base is actually a cube. It represents the four elements and the dimensions of space-time. So through the model or symbol of the pyramid, you see the whole flow from unity into multiplicity as an entire thing or wholeness.
I think of other monuments that were purposely buried, maybe because they were too powerful, maybe because the creatures that built them didn't want us to destroy ourselves with that technology. That maybe those areas, if you go deep enough, have the kind of rock strata necessary in order to cause these vibrational frequencies to occur.
If the Pre-Adamites existed and Antarctica was their base where they built powerful pyramids to affect the planet, how would revealing this now affect the world we live in today?
But it does seem that this civilization would have been literally indestructible as we moved into the final 12,000 years of this big cycle. So what appears to have happened is that, in fact, there was a judgment made to allow this flood to occur, and that the flood not only sank the Atlantean continent, making it Antarctica, but it also did sink many other areas of megalithic architecture, such as the gorgeous pyramid that we see in the Azores off the coast of Portugal, such as the sunken architecture we see off the western tip of Cuba, and what we see around the coast of India. What we see in Japan is where you have a sunken architecture down there. All kinds of anomalies are being discovered that defy the conventional view. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey just being another example. It appears that this was a benevolently designed event which had the purpose of giving these negative groups their karma, to wipe them out in a way that their karma had invited, authorized, and paved the way for a humanity that is not so corrupt, negative, and evil to be able to use the earth for its own benefit.
Could this pre-Adamite culture have created a different kind of world using their knowledge of pyramid building? Was their influence positive or negative on the surface of Earth? If there was such a species that existed, could this represent a different genetic code than that of humans? Is it possible that this different species was almost destroyed in a cataclysm that encouraged the survival of the human species to shepherd the Earth? As Antarctica continues to melt away more evidence, a location on the other side of the globe reveals elongated heads and a planetary alignment that leaves experts baffled on its ancient connection.
There is a theory that in addition to the influence of the sun and the moon and the power of the eclipses, that Stonehenge has a connection with the influence of Saturn.
Could elongated heads also be traced to Stonehenge? Is it possible that this monument is connected with certain planets, and if so, why?